let's talk about what I read in July. So this wrap-up is coming pretty late. I don't know what happened. Time completely got away from me. I am not on schedule at all with my reading. For July, my plan was to read works by Indigenous authors, as well as work on my list of 30 books I wanted to read before I was 30, because I turned 30 at the end of August. Now, let me say, only one of those two objectives went well, and it most definitely was not the books I was supposed to read before I was 30. So the first things that I want to talk about in this reading vlog, besides the Indigenous reads as well as the 30 for 30 reads, I want to talk about the age gap books I read for my 50 Shades of Smut series. I recently put up episode 2, which was all based around age gap novels, and so I'm just going to quickly kind of sum up my thoughts on those books. Obviously there are more in-depth thoughts if you watch that video. For once, I have one of the novels right here. So the first book I read was On the Island by Tracee Garvis. This book was about an older woman who ends up being a teacher to this 15 or 16-year-old boy. They end up getting stranded on this island together, just them, and eventually they start up a sexual and emotional relationship. Now, rest assured, this doesn't happen until he's of age, but obviously there is still a big age gap aspect. I didn't feel like the age gap aspect really came into play that much. This book focused a lot more on their survival, which I thought was interesting, but not all of it really worked for me. I definitely thought that everything was a little too convenient. Once we moved away from the survival aspects and into the emotional relationship aspects, I just didn't think it worked. I had absolutely no investment in this couple and did not care if they stayed together or broke up, so I gave this, I believe, 2 out of 5 stars. The second thing I read for this vlog was Hush Hush by Lucia Franco. This was about a sex worker who ends up falling in love with a client who's much, much older than her. I absolutely hated this book. I felt like there was way too much shame on sex work, which really pissed me off because I was hoping for a much more positive portrayal. That's why I went into this book. I really hated the main character with every fiber of my being. I also didn't really love the love interest. I thought he was a little too smooth and suave and but not in a way that I found hot. I just found it kind of cringy. And overall, I believe I gave this like 1.5 or 2 stars. It was not for me whatsoever. The third book I read was Dreams of 18 by Saffron A. Kent. I've read other books from Saffron A. Kent in the past and really enjoyed them, and this was another winner. I believe I gave this 3.5 stars. This was about a young girl who had a crush on her neighbor who is much, much older than her. He's about 35. It's actually her best friend's dad. On her 18th birthday, she decides to go over and kiss him. People end up catching them. It ends up being a huge scandal around the town. He ends up leaving and kind of getting pushed out of the town by the scandal because he's the school's basketball coach. So it's not okay for him to be kissing a student. She ends up having an emotional breakdown, ends up in the psychiatric ward, and after she gets out, she decides to find him and make amends for ruining his life. Because he really had no agency in this kiss, it was kind of all her, so she really feels like it was her fault that she fucked up his life. I think that Saffron A. Kent does mental health rep really, really right. This is something that goes throughout all of her books. She makes it believable, and she doesn't use it as some sort of quirk. It's very grounded in reality, it's emotional, it's heavy. I also think she does smut pretty well. She does the dirty talk, and all of her sex scenes are pretty explicit, and they just really, really work for me. I think that if you have an age gap kink, you're going to love this book because I really think she nails the sort of kinky aspects of it really well. I just think overall her books are always hot. Next I read Forbidden by Seven Rue, which was quite an experience. It was a 60-page novella about this girl who has sex with her father, uncle, and her father's best friend. These are not blood related, but it's very clear that the author wanted this to be an incest romance because she really drives home that daddy part, and I was not into it whatsoever. This is definitely not my kink. But even more so than that, the book was just not good. This was not an actual book, really. There was no story, there were no characters. This is just porn. It had no depth to it whatsoever. It was very explicit, so if you're just looking for something that gets you off and this is the type of thing you are interested in, then maybe this will work for you, but it was not for me, and I gave it 1 star. The last book I read for that vlog was Birthday Girl by Penelope Douglas. Most of you have probably heard about this. It is about a girl who falls in love with her boyfriend slash ex-boyfriend's father. She ends up having to live with him because her and her boyfriend get kicked out of their apartment. I pretty much ended up hating this book. I don't think I'll be reading Penelope Douglas anymore. I just like don't get on with her work in the same way that a lot of other people do. I fucking hated the main character. I fucking hated the love interest. So yeah, this book did not go well for me. I just really couldn't get on board with any of the selfish decisions that the main character and the love interest made, and my problems were that the book didn't see these as selfish decisions. I love a good bully romance. I love watching fucked up people have some like crazy ass sex scenes, like that's my shit. But I want the book to be self-aware about it, and that's not what this book was. This book was made to be like this sexy romance, and I was not buying that. And I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. So first, let's talk about the list that did go well, and that was the books by Indigenous authors. I think I had about 9 books on my list that I wanted to read in the first 2 weeks of July, and I managed to read 8 of them. So that's not so bad, and I'm hoping to still read The Marrow Thieves probably this month, in August. So let's talk about the first book I finished in July, which was Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Reisz. Now, I talked about this book a little bit already in my current faves video that I did a while back. Also, let me just say, July must have lasted forever because I can't believe that this is the same month that I read that. I mean, it's not because it's the middle of August now, but still, it feels like that was 6 months ago. I don't know. I don't understand how time is working right now. Now, Moon of the Crusted Snow is about this Anishinaabe community in northern Canada where the power goes out and things really devolve rapidly. I loved this novel. Like, I really, really enjoyed it. I just found that anytime I put it down, I just immediately wanted to pick it back up. It's incredibly quick. Like, it's not a long book, yet I feel like so much is packed into it, and the author does such a great job of letting the characters speak for themselves. He doesn't spoon feed you information and tell you like this character is good and this character is bad. The author was also really good at creating tension. Like, you definitely could feel things getting worse and worse. He's the first author I think I've ever read that used like the dreams trope to actually create tension well. I hate dreams in novels. It's something that I literally can't stand, and this is the first novel where I actually felt like it had a purpose. I really liked some of the themes and ideas that were explored in this novel. They talked about just how the white colonizers of Canada had kept pushing these Indigenous communities into different places, into smaller areas of land, because they kept taking over more and more land. And they also kept pushing their resources on to these Indigenous communities and, you know, putting it off as like it was this great thing that the government was doing for them, like giving them internet access and things like that. But this novel kind of showed like what happens when you kind of force these ideas on to Indigenous people, kind of force them to let go of their culture and move away from their way of life. And then after giving them all this stuff, like what happens when you take it all away? Overall, I just really, really love this novel. I totally recommend it, and it was a great start to my reading month. So the next book I finished in July was Bone Black by Carol Rose GoldenEagle. This book I kind of had a weird relationship with. This novel was about the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. This is a horrible thing that continues to go underreported and underinvestigated. Indigenous women continue to go missing across Canada, and nobody seems to investigate it properly. These cases never seem to get solved. And this book kind of took a fictional look at that. The main character lives in a community where women have gone missing, and her sister is partly investigating it, or I believe her sister was a lawyer who was prosecuting some of these crimes and trying to get these cases more attention. One day her sister comes to visit her, and then her sister goes missing. The first half of this book I found very stilted and very formal, just the way it was written, the style of the writing, and I felt this distance between like the audience and the main character, and so like I couldn't quite feel her emotions properly. But all of that was just set up. Like, the setup took a really long time to get to the point of where the actual story started, where the meat of the story started. Once the big plot points started to happen, like, it almost became a completely separate book, but I really loved that second half. It definitely was more about female rage. The absolute aggravation at having to watch a violent thing after violent thing happen to women, and especially happening to women in your own community, and not being able to do a damn thing about it. And just feeling like no one cares, no one's even paying attention. So this woman starts to do something about it, and boy does it get violent. You know, it's definitely a book about grief. It's definitely a book about healing. There was just a lot of different things being explored here. It didn't all work for me, but I did really enjoy reading it. I'm really glad I read it, and I would give this about 3, maybe 3.5 stars. The next thing I read was This Place, 150 Years Retold. This was a comic anthology by a ton of different Indigenous writers. They each took a little piece of Canada's history and told it through the Indigenous perspective. Me personally, I don't love anthologies. I really wanted to read this to know more about Canada's history, especially from that perspective, and I really enjoyed learning more about it. But of course, being an anthology, I'm never gonna like absolutely love it because I just want to know more about the characters. I want to follow the characters throughout more of their lives. Being an anthology, I of course like some more than others. That's just the way anthologies go. I ended up giving this 3 to 5 stars, but I think it's a good one. I especially think if you like anthologies, then this will really work for you. Next thing I listened to an audiobook, and that was Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq. I'm not sure how to explain what this is about. Like, truly, I don't know what the synopsis is, even after reading it. I definitely had a harder time with this one because I didn't totally understand what was going on. I really loved the first chunk of it, probably like the first 25%, because I felt like the author did such a good job of capturing this like whimsy of childhood, and there was such a stark contrast between the fun, lovely parts of childhood and the violence that the characters in this had to witness. I feel like the author did such a great job at showing both of those sides. She has such an evocative way of writing. A lot of things in this novel are extremely dark. There's definitely a large theme on the loss of innocence. The second half just like went in a totally different direction that I was not expecting, and I mean, I literally wrote in my review of it just like, how do I rate this? Did I like it? I have no idea. I definitely think if you want to listen to it, it's unlike anything else I've ever read or listened to, and it's just a completely unique experience. The next thing I read was another graphic novel, and that was A Girl Called Echo. So I had something else on my TBR, but I couldn't get a hold of it, so I ended up picking up this one, which had been on my TBR for a really, really long time, and somehow I just like didn't look into it that deeply, so I didn't know it was an Indigenous works. I decided to read it for this, and unfortunately this didn't really work for me. But only because I am very much someone, when I read comics, I like a lot of dialogue. If you've ever read the comic book Isola, to me, this had that same problem. We were mostly getting the story through the illustrations. That's very much how A Girl Called Echo was. Now, this was a story about a girl who kind of time travels, almost. Like, she'll fall asleep, and in her dreams, she will go back in time to these huge moments in Indigenous history. So it kind of reminds me of Kindred in that way by Octavia Butler, except I don't believe she's tied to any one person. I wouldn't know because I only read the first volume. I read this entire volume in about 5 minutes because of how little dialogue there was. That's really all it comes down to. If you're fine with just that visual illustration being the entire way you get your information, then you're gonna love this. There's nothing necessarily wrong with this, it's just not my preferred style of comic, and that's it. Another audiobook I listened to was Seven Fallen Feathers by Tanya Talaga. This was a recounting of the 7 Indigenous students in Thunder Bay, Ontario, who've died in mysterious circumstances. This was a really interesting audiobook. There was a lot of ground to cover, and I do think that gave it a little bit of disservice, only because like I just wanted more. I wanted to know their families more, to know their specific circumstances more, but I also think the author did like as good a job as she could have without making this a much, much bigger audiobook or much bigger book. She went into each of the students' deaths separately, so you at least got to know a little bit about their individual lives and who they were before they died. There are definitely similar circumstances in each of the cases, because they were all students who were forced to go to these schools that were miles and miles away from their hometowns and their families. It really showed just how flawed the system was, that each of the cases were so similar, because it showed that obviously there were very crucial things that were going wrong for this to keep happening. There were so many like important members of these Indigenous communities who had said like, we've talked to law enforcement, we've talked to the government, we've told them exactly what they have to do to change things, to stop this from happening again, and they continue to be ignored. I think if you live in Ontario and this is something that interests you, and it should, then I think this is a great audiobook to pick up to find out more about it. So moving on to my 30 before 30 list. It has not gone well. My goal was to try and get 15 out of 30, because clearly 30 is not happening. I think I've read 5. So I was like, you know, if I could just hit a passing grade, I'd feel pretty good about myself. There is no freaking way that's happening. I really didn't look into these books that I put on my list, clearly, because the first one that I decided to pick up was The Count of Monte Cristo. God damn it. The Count of Monte Cristo. It is 1,300 pages. Why didn't I know that before I put it on my TBR? Why didn't I know that before it was the first book I picked up? That was... Anyways, I'm not done it. So, I'm debating DNFing it. I'm 62% of the way in, but I'm still debating DNFing it. I still have 40% left. 20 hours is still left in that audiobook. Like, what am I doing with my life? I can't. Anyways, the one book I finished towards that list in July was Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I think we all know what Little Women is about. It's about a family called the Marches. Marches? I read 25% of this physically, and when I first started it, I was like, oh, I love this. It's so Christmassy. It's so, like, lovely and wonderful, and it's all based around, like, family and warmth and comfort. And then by 25%, I was like, okay, I'm bored. Like, tweeness can only get me so far. After a while, I just find it unbelievably dull and very unconvincing. Like, I don't believe in any of these people in the way that they act towards each other. So then I decided to switch to the audiobook, and that was definitely the way to go. I gotta say that this book felt incredibly Christian. Like, I think about halfway through, I was like, this feels like Christian propaganda. Like, it just felt like they were like, you know, life is good as long as you believe in God and country and your family. And I'm like, all right. That's really not my jam. But once I looked up when this was made, I felt a little bit better. Like, for some reason, I thought this was made in the 1940s. I didn't realize this was made in the 1800s. So I gotta give this book props because it does not feel as old as it is. The fact that it's even remotely still relevant is pretty impressive. I did come to enjoy some of the characters. I actually really love Amy March. Her bluntness with Laurie in the second half of the book is pretty great. Jo is obviously everyone's favorite character because, I mean, she's pretty fantastic. So overall, I didn't hate this as much as I thought I was going to about halfway through. I was ready to just, like, give up on it completely, but I think I ended up giving this 3 stars. I didn't hate it. I'm very excited to watch the movie, the new adaptation by Greta Gerwig. Like, I know everyone has said it's amazing, and I've seen that trailer like 20 times. I'm pretty sure our roof is just gonna, like, cave in with water. Now, of course, because I'm me, I can't just stick to a TBR, so here are some other books that I read in July that had nothing to do with the TBR I set out to read. The first thing was Consumed by J.R. Ward. This was a book about firefighters and recovery. The main character has wanted to be a firefighter her whole life, and she has been absolutely great at it. Her family was full of firefighters or something. Her love interest is a firefighter. All of her friends are firefighters, etc., etc. The book starts off with a bang. It's a pretty long action sequence between her and her love interest and this fire that they're in. She's definitely this character who, like, you know, doesn't listen. Like, she's always the dumb one that runs forward into the fire when her boss is screaming at her, like, no, what are you doing? Get out of there. Let's just say some things go wrong, and they lead to her having to quit the firefighting lifestyle and recover for, I don't know, the rest of her life or whatever. Sometimes once you start an audiobook, if it's only like 10 hours long and you're listening to it on 2 speed, it's just like, I'll finish it. And that's kind of where this one was, because I really didn't particularly like the love interest. I didn't particularly like the main character, but it was easy to listen to while I played on my phone, so I did. I do think that there was some decent representation and some deep diving into, like, mental and physical recovery for when you've gone through something traumatic. There was a mystery aspect that I didn't particularly love. I just didn't find it very interesting, and a lot of the book hinged on that. I think if you're interested in reading a book about this sort of subject and about a romance between 2 people who have kind of been driven apart by this traumatic event, then I think it's pretty okay. They're definitely not likable characters, but I think that they're unlikable in mostly forgivable ways, in mostly believable ways. These are interesting people. I'm just not necessarily a romance person unless it's erotica, and this wasn't. I finally read Heartstopper Volume 1, 2, and 3, by Alice Oseman. This is a comic book series about Nick and Charlie and it's really just a coming of age tale and them finding themselves, finding a love interest in each other, and it follows on their lives. I didn't love this as much as I thought I would, and that was shocking because everyone loves it so much. I just find that I don't know enough about these characters. I thought they would be more in-depth than they are. I think there are certain things the books do really well and a lot of other things that they don't. The one thing I think Alice Oseman nails is conversations. I think she gets that teen voice pretty much exact. And I think that's hard when you're an adult to do. I mean, I've seen it screwed up a million times, most times really. I think that's why this stood out so much, was just, it did feel so spot on to how teens talk to each other. I gave this series overall 3 stars. I would maybe bump the volume 3 up to a 4-star because I did like it a little bit more than the other 2. I just want a deeper understanding of who these characters are. Another thing that I mentioned in my current faves that I read in July was Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. This is a middle grade fantasy series about a girl named Sophie who finds out that she is secretly an elf. She has to leave her human family and the human world and go away to this elf academy and this elf world and find out who she really is. I really enjoyed the shit out of this book. I didn't know I was a middle grade reader, but I fell in love with Nevermore, so I decided to try another series, and this one is definitely another winner. I don't love it as much as Nevermore, but I really am enjoying it. I just think everything about the series is really fun and comforting, and I don't have a ton to say about it. I think it got a little bit darker than I was expecting to get in the very first book. But as someone who is older, obviously I enjoy that. I don't enjoy all the romance aspects, but that's, once again, because I'm not this age group. I think this is perfect for someone who is in middle grade. Honestly, the only thing I don't like about this series is the main character's relationship with her friend Dex. I just find him super fucking annoying, and I think he's pretty controlling for just some dude who's a friend who clearly has a crush on her, but still, he's a little entitled. Regardless, I love everything else about this world. I really enjoy the adult characters and their relationships with Sophie because, you know, she's someone who's clearly looking for a family since she had to leave hers. I just really enjoyed it overall, and I'm really looking forward to reading more of the series. The last book that I read in July was The King by Tiffany Reisz. This is like the 6th book in the original Sinner series. I've mentioned this series a lot on my channel. It is by far my absolute favorite smutty series, my favorite romance series. I just think it's fucking fantastic. Tiffany Reisz is probably my only auto-buy author in like the world right now. The first 3 books in the series are by far my favorite, but I love these characters so much. I would follow them to the ends of the earth. I will read everything she ever puts out with them because they are part of my soul at this point. This book mostly focused on Kingsley, who is probably my favorite character in this series, so I was ecstatic to have another book that surrounds him. It follows him and his life as he creates the underground as we know it. This book comes before the first 4 books in the series, and it just kind of shows him creating his BDSM empire. I loved that this really explored who he is and what drives him as a person. He definitely started off in the first book in the series as more of a supporting character. He didn't really have a lot of like screen time in the first book, and I just loved getting to know more about him here. This book actually focused a lot on his relationship with his assistant, who is kind of, you know, his right-hand woman. You don't get to see a lot of his assistant in the first 5 books, but you do see her here and there, and she's clearly very important to him, but you learn just how important in this book. He kind of starts to fall in love with her, even though she's gay and has no interest in him in that way. And I felt like this book did a really great job of course, walking the edge, because this is a writer who loves to do just a little bit of taboo. So it really walked right to that edge of like, maybe they're attracted to each other, but it never went too far. It never got into a place of trying to like turn her straight or anything like that. I think it showed how complicated relationships can be, how complicated attraction and sexual orientation can be. I think the author did a great job of respecting both of these characters' sexualities, both these characters' personalities, while still showing just how deep their friendship went. And while still putting in just like a little taste of taboo. Overall, I really enjoyed this book. I gave it 3.5 stars, but I'll probably love anything Tiffany Reisz writes. So that's it. Those are the books I read for July. It was kind of a messy month. It continues to be a messy month in August, so I hope you liked this video, and I hope you come back again soon. Bye.